Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to talk a little bit about the cell theory. So, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to summarize some of the most important concepts discussed in class regarding the cell theory, and hopefully, this video will help you guys review what you need to review in that sense. So let me look for the pages here real quick and then let's get started. So today we talked about the cell theory, and I know today it was a little bit more of a history class because I wanted to stretch the point that the cell theory is not a relatively old theory. In fact, it's pretty new when you compare it to the fact that the discovery or the formation of the cell theory or the first concepts of the cell theory didn't occur until 1838, which is like 182 years ago. And I was explaining that a lot of these discoveries didn't happen until more or less the Renaissance period, when people started to focus more on a scientific approach, and certain taboos of the time had been eliminated. And that gave way to the development of the cell theories and a lot of the theories in biology, and then a lot of other theories in chemistry, like the atomic model and all these other things. So let's get started real quick. And what I want to start with is a couple of dates. So in your book, it says that in 1665, Robert Hooke used the three-lens compound microscope to examine slices of cork. So in 1665, Robert Hooke used the three-lens compound microscope to examine thin slices of cork. Of course, because these slices of cork had hollow components, he called them cells. The thin slices of cork, which actually comes from a plant. It's the cork is the outer bark of a species of oak tree. So you'll find the cork in some oak trees, and the thin slices of cork reminded Hooke of rooms in a monastery that he called cells. So he observed the cork, which again is found in some oak trees, and when he saw that they were made of thin, they were hollow, they had kind of spaces in between, and he called them cells because they reminded him, of cells, which were rooms found in some monasteries. So that's where the term cells come from. However, in 1674, about 9 years later, in 1674, Anton von Lieuwenhoek, who was a Dutch tradesman, Anton, and that's a weird last name to spell, so I'm gonna try to do it as best I can. Leeuwenhoek, who was a Dutch tradesman, was trying to examine cloths and with a single cell microscope. with a single lens microscope, I'm sorry, who was examining cloth with a single lens microscope. Single lens microscope. Became one of the first people to describe living cells. First people to describe living cells. Okay, so, and let me get my charger here real quick before the power runs out. Interesting fact is that most discoveries occur purely by accident. Robert Hooke was not intending necessarily to discover the cell. Although he was a scientist, he was probably just testing the lens on a microscope. And Anton von Lieuwenhoek, who was not even a scientist, he was a Dutch tradesman, and he was trying to examine cloths. And both Hooke and von Leeuwenhoek discovered the cell, but purely by accident, or discovered what they saw, which were later turned out to be cells, purely by accident. Now, the interesting thing about or the detail that I wrote there when I was mentioning that von Leeuwenhoek became one of the first people to discuss or to describe living cells is because the cells that Hooke were looking at were dead. He was looking at cork, which is found in some species of oak tree, but they were dead. They weren't alive. What made von Leeuwenhoek's discovery so distinct was that he was observing living cells. And von Leeuwenhoek was actually looking at the cells in a sample of pond water. Okay, so later on, that led to the discovery of the cell theory. Now, how so? Well, as time progressed, instrumentation to observe living organisms got better and got more precise. And this led to other biologists, other scientists, putting in their grain, putting in their 2 cents, so to speak, in terms of developing or finding new discoveries, which then brings us to what we're going to discuss today, which is the cell theory. Now, before I actually talk about the cell theory per se, I want to talk a little bit about the events that led up to the discovery of the cell theory. And the first person, or the first thing that led up to this, is that in 1838, German scientist Matthias Sheldon Shaden, I'm sorry, not Sheldon, Shaden, Matthias Shaden, um, proposed that plants were made of cells. Plants were made of cells. Okay. Matthias Shaden proposed that plants were made of cells. Now, the interesting thing is that he decided to share his findings with Theodore Schwann. Okay, so Shaden went over to Schwann, and he showed Schwann what he had discovered, and he said that plants are made of cells. And at the same time, Schwann was actually studying animal cells, and Schwann, based on what Shaden had said, Schwann concluded that animals were also made of cells. Well, he didn't conclude that animals were made of cells. He was studying animal cells. I'm sorry, and and based on what Shaden had said, and based on his own discovery, he also discovered that animals were made of cells. And in 1839, Schwann published the first statement of the cell theory. The first statement of the cell theory. And Schwann stated that all living organisms are made of cells. He concluded that all living organisms were made of cells. Okay, so he concluded that in 1839. So in 1838, Shaden discovered that plants were made of cells. At the same time, Schwann was studying animals, and he just concluded that animals are also made of cells. And in 1839, he published the first statement of the cell theory. However, we have to understand that given the time, there was not a lot of scientific technology available like there is today, where we can make more concise statements or conclusive statements. Now, he did know that all organisms were made of living cells, or all living organisms were made of cells, but he didn't know how they formed. So he basically established that cells were just formed randomly. And it wasn't until 1855 that this statement was corrected. So the cell theory underwent underwent modifications throughout time, and one of them was in 1855. Rudolf Rudolf Virchow reported that all cells come from pre-existing cells. That all cells come from pre-existing cells. Okay, so in 1855, Rudolf Virchow reported that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So he said that they don't form randomly, but that they actually have to come from another existing cells, which is true, and that today is widely thought to be true or proven to be true. And let's talk about the cell theory and the 3 points of the cell theory. So the cell theory, where the first part or the first statement was proposed by Schwann, but in 1839, but was later other things added to it, states 3 important principles. Number 1, all organisms are composed of cells. Number 2, cells come from pre-existing cells. And 3, the cell is the basic unit of life. So those are the 3 main conclusions of the cell theory. All organisms are composed of cells. Cells come from pre-existing cells, and the cell is the basic unit of life. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit more specifically about certain other aspects of the cell. So we know the cell theory and we know the events that led up to the discovery of the cell theory. But here are some other things that we need to understand. Is that in general, and here are some general traits of cells. Okay, so let's write that. Some general traits of cells. General traits of cells. One is that cells tend to be microscopic in size. So cells are microscopic in size and have similar building blocks. Have similar building blocks. They are enclosed by a membrane that controls them. They are enclosed by a membrane that controls the movement of materials. Materials into and out of the cell. Okay, so again, cells or some general traits of cells is that cells are microscopic in size, they have similar building blocks, and they are enclosed by a membrane that controls the movement of materials into and out of the cell. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is that cells have a cytoplasm and an organelle. So let's talk about cytoplasm. Cytoplasm are specialized structures or are structures specialize are structures specialized to perform distinct processes within a cell. So there are many structures inside of a cytoplasm. It's not like one structure itself, but rather a combination of structures. Let me see if I can move this further down here, and then I can just move this down here. There we go. Okay. And we're going to talk about organelles. Oh, I'm sorry. I just realized that I gave you the definition of organelles. Excuse me. So let me go ahead and erase this. I wrote the wrong definition. I apologize for that. Let's try that again. This is live, and these things tend to happen. Let's talk about the cytoplasm. I'm sorry. The cytoplasm is a jelly-like substance. That's what I should have said. Jelly-like substance. A jelly-like substance that contains dissolved molecules that contains dissolved molecules building blocks, such as proteins, nucleic acids, minerals, and ions. Minerals and ions. So this is the correct definition of cytoplasm. I apologize for that. So the cytoplasm is kind of like a jelly-like substance inside the cells, and that's where you have, you know, proteins and you have nucleic acids. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about that more in depth later. And you have other structures like the nucleus and all these other things that we're going to see as this chapter progresses. The other, now we're going to define organelles, and organelles can be defined as specialized structures to that perform distinct processes within a cell. That perform distinct processes within a cell. Okay? Processes within a cell. So the organelles have a lot of different structures. Of course, the largest and most visible structure, or the largest and most visible organelle and most visible organelle is the nucleus. And of course, the nucleus stores the genetic information, which stores the genetic information. Okay. Now, cells, or there are different types of cells. We're going to talk about them general. We're not really going to go in depth into them, but there is the prokaryotic cell and the eukaryotic cell. So let's talk a little bit about the prokaryotic cell and traits of the prokaryotic cell. Okay. Prokaryotic cell. Number one, the prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. And let's kind of compare and contrast them. They do not have a nucleus. Number two is the cell's DNA is suspended in the cytoplasm. Is suspended in the cytoplasm. And lastly, most prokaryotic cells are, or most prokaryotes, I'm sorry, most, I think it's better, most prokaryotes are microscopic single-celled organisms, are microscopic single-celled organisms. Now, So let's go over them real quick. So prokaryotic cells, they don't have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles, okay? So it's not just that they don't have a nucleus, it's just they don't have any organelles bound to the membrane. Secondly, the cell's DNA is, since it doesn't have a nucleus, instead of the DNA being stored in the nucleus, it's actually suspended inside of the cytoplasm. And lastly is that most prokaryotes are single-celled microscopic organisms, such as bacteria, although not all bacteria have prokaryotic cells. There are other types of organisms. And now let's compare it real quick to the eukaryotic cell. Now, prokaryote kind of means old, eukaryotic means new, and there are some theories that suggest that the eukaryotic cell actually evolved from the prokaryotic cell, but that's another story. Let's talk a little bit about that. The eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, and membrane-bound organelles. Two is that the nucleus encloses the genetic information. Encloses the genetic information, whereas in the prokaryotics or cell, the information is suspended in the cytoplasm. And eukaryotes may be multicellular or single-celled organisms. Eukaryotes may be single-celled or multicellular organisms. Okay, so if you compare the two, prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. The cell's DNA is suspended in the cytoplasm, and most prokaryotes are microscopic single-celled organisms, whereas in the eukaryotic cells, we have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. The nucleus encloses the genetic information instead of it being suspended in the cytoplasm like it is here. And lastly is that eukaryotes may be single-celled or multicellular organisms. So you may have a single-cell organisms like algae or other types of single-cell organisms that can actually have a eukaryotic cell, or multicellular organisms like in the case of humans, for example. So guys, this is it for section 3.1, the cell theory. I hope this video helps you guys out. Stay safe, and we'll see each other soon. Bye-bye.